This finance bill gives effect, as the Minister said, to a number of tax changes announced in Budget 2024, in addition to a number of other important provisions and changes to our tax code. And we can't consider this legislation before setting out the context in which it is being introduced. Our economy has faced a number of interrelated shocks over the last number of years. We've seen an energy price shock, the spike in inflation which has impacted prices across so many goods and services, and the tightening of monetary policy which has increased borrowing costs for households and for firms. But despite these challenges, the domestic economy has displayed resilience. However, considerable risks remain, and the impact of inflation and performance of the labour market has been uneven. Higher prices hit lower and middle-income households hardest, while research has indicated that the incomes of low and middle-income households have either fallen or stagnated in recent years. The deepening housing crisis poses real threats to not only the living standards of our citizens, but also to the competitiveness of our economy. Our health service is under threat, with its underfunding by the government posing a serious risk to patients and healthcare staff. And the first and most immediate concern of workers and families is the cost of living crisis that has dragged on incomes and household finances for well over a year now. While the rate of annual inflation has fallen from its peak of last year, it remains still high, standing at 6.4% in September of this year. And while the Department expects this rate to moderate to 2.9% next year, it's important to note that the prices are not expected to fall. The increases in prices are here to stay. The tax code can play an important role in supporting workers and households with the cost of living crisis. But it is always important that any such tax package is fair, ensuring that the benefits do not accrue disproportionately to those on highest incomes, but instead supports those who need it most. And for a number of years now, Sinn Féin have argued that the fairest way to reduce the tax burden on families and households is through the cuts to the USC, the Universal Social Charge. And given the discussion preceding the budget, it is clear that Sinn Féin has won that argument. The tax packages in recent years have been unfair and regressive, providing much more to those on the highest income levels compared to lower and middle income earners. Sinn Féin in our alternative budget proposed a tax package that focused on cutting the bottom rates of USC and increasing the entry point to the third rate, beginning the journey of removing the first €30,000 workers earn from the liability of USC. In this finance bill, the government have taken a different course, and it is regrettable that under sections 2 and 9 of the bill, someone earning €35,000 will benefit by less than €310, while somebody earning €200,000 will benefit by €860. So €310 for somebody earning €35,000, and somebody earning €200,000 would benefit by more than €860. And the distributional impact of this tax package does not seem to pass the fairness test. However, there are provisions in the bill that we welcome. The extension of the USC concession for medical card holders has been extended, a measure that we called for. In addition, there are necessary provisions, including the extension of relief for benefit in kind with respect to company cards, without which many workers would have seen a significant increase in their tax liability. Furthermore, a decision to extend the current benefits in kind regime with respect to electric vehicles is a common-sense proposal, without which the incentives for companies to transition to electric vehicles would have been undermined. The spike in energy prices has been a key factor in the cost of living crisis for many, many households, with the price of petrol, diesel, electricity, gas and home heating oil all spiralling since 2022. Section 56 of this bill extends the reduced 9% rate of VAT applying to electricity and gas, a measure Sinn Féin repeatedly called for before its introduction. As we all know, the price of petrol and diesel at the pump has been rising in recent months, and the government increased the tax applied to fuel in September and was set to hike petrol and diesel prices again on the 31st of October. Sinn Féin called on the government to use a common-sense approach and scrap these planned hikes, and thankfully the government have heeded this advice and reflected in section 49, and that's despite, as I pointed out earlier on, the Minister making the point during the passage of the Finance Bill last year that he was not minded to do this, regardless of the price of the pumps. However, it is deeply regrettable that the government pushed ahead with a further carbon tax hike on the 11th of October. And what that did was it increased fuel prices, with further hikes to come in May and October of next year. And this is in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and it's the wrong approach, and it reflects the government's wider policy. Without providing access to affordable public transport and retrofitting households risk being punished without any real alternative or affordable alternative to them. And it can be summed up in the simple message of far too much stick and too little carrot. It is time for the government to change its approach. A clear gap in this legislation is again concerning home heating oil. 1/3 of households across the state, 2/3 in the North West, rely on home heating oil as the main fuel source. But there is no measure to reduce its price despite its rising costs. Sinn Féin proposed slashing the rate of excise duty to reduce the fill of your tank by €64, and this proposal was not implemented by government. Instead, households are what are they set for? Another price hike in home heating oil come May of next year through a further increase in carbon tax. Chairperson, as I referenced earlier, while the rate of inflation is set to ease, the facts remain that prices will remain elevated and the high cost of living will persist, and no more is this the case than with respect to the housing sector. Since July of last year, the European Central Bank has increased its key lending rates 10 times. The impact has been significant, with mortgage interest costs soaring, increasing by 50% in the past year, and it's estimated that 1 in 5 households would have seen their annual mortgage costs rise by more than €3,000, and a further 1 in 5 seen their mortgage costs rise by more than €5,700. And this was before the last ECB hike took effect. Then, of course, we have the 80,000 households who have had their loans sold to the vulture funds, with many of them facing interest rates much higher than those faced in the mainstream mortgage market. And for several months now, Sinn Féin have called for the introduction of a temporary and target mortgage interest relief to support these struggling households. As absorbing 30% of increased mortgage costs, capped at a maximum benefit of €15 per household, the government refused to implement our proposal and instead for months criticised it. Indeed, they were scathing of it. Section 13 of this bill represents a screeching and belated U-turn on the part of the government. The mortgage interest tax relief proposed at 20% of increased costs with a cap of €1,250 bears a striking resemblance to the scheme we proposed, another argument won by Sinn Féin. But there appears to be serious problems with this section of the bill. It disqualifies a household from the relief if the outstanding balance on their mortgage at the end of 2022 was less than €80,000. That makes no sense. But it is the case that households who have, for example, been on a tracker rate with an outstanding balance of less than €80,000 will have seen their mortgage costs rise by nearly €2,000 in the last year. And the Minister should clarify this. Why are these households exempt? It makes no sense whatsoever. The reason for this restriction is absolutely unclear. And secondly, the estimated number of households that would have otherwise qualified for the relief had this restriction not been in place. As it is often the case, it seems the government have, despite initially opposing it, implemented Sinn Féin policy, but with significant shortcomings. And we can see that time and time again as this government tries to play catch-up. We need to get this right, and I look forward to scrutinising Section 13 at committee stage. As we know, the government's housing crisis has become a social disaster. With every passing month, the situation is worsening. It speaks volumes that the government decided in this budget to stick with the housing targets that are doomed to fail, with no further increases in housing investment beyond them. And I note changes to the residential zoned land tax in Section 88 of the bill. We've been raising the issue of farmers since the last finance bill. He's ignored it, and now because he's haven't fixed it, he's deferring the whole bloody thing for a year. I welcome, the decision to postpone this has to be done now because you haven't done anything over the last year, which has been pointed out to you when the Minister was dealing with the finance bill last year. We know the concern of the agricultural community, and it's important that we get it right. But it should have been got right during the year, not postponing the whole thing for another year. One of the most surprising provisions of the legislation is, without doubt, Section 21, which provides a tax break. Well, maybe it's not surprising, given that this is, again, a Fianna Fáil Finance Minister, with the support of Fine Gael, who's introducing this budget. So it's a tax break of €600, rising to €1,000 for landlords. Now, don't take my word for it. Professor Barrett Rowntree, formerly of the ESRI, described this tax break as perhaps, I quote, the stupidest tax relief of recent times against stiff competition. Minister. That's what the professor said. The stupidest tax relief of recent times against stiff competition. Why? Because we all know that this tax break is going to cost up to €160 million in the first year, and the vast majority of it is going straight into the pockets of landlords who never had any intention of leaving the market. And I'm sure many of your government colleagues who are landlords probably have no intention of leaving the market either. The Minister's Department has made its thoughts on this issue crystal clear. Firstly, the tax measure will have little impact, if any, on the supply of rental properties, and secondly, that such a measure would raise considerable equity issues in the tax code, and that is exactly what you have done. And I put the question to you again, why do you stand there introducing a piece of legislation where a nurse will pay more on income tax than a landlord? Why do that? Because the nurses are leaving, and they're leaving in bigger numbers than the landlords. They're going to Australia, they're in Perth, they're in Sydney, they're in London, they're in Canada. And why are you saying as Minister for Finance that a nurse has to pay more tax than a landlord with multiple properties that has no intention of leaving? It is a disgrace, and as Barry Rowntree say, it is the stupidest tax relief of recent times, especially when it will have no impact other than increasing the bank balance of these same landlords. It's depressing for renters and struggling home buyers that the government has chosen to prioritise an expensive, ineffective and unfair tax cut for landlords, but again it is not surprising. What is surprising is they have given more money to landlords in this budget than you've given to struggling renters. This was a landlord's budget, not a renter's budget, and that's what we needed. We needed a renter's budget. It's disappointing that the government didn't take the opportunity to introduce legislation to scrap its flawed and counterproductive concrete products levy. This is the second year you've dealt with this. In the middle of a housing crisis, you go ahead with a plan to increase the price of building a house by €1,200. Your plan was so flawed last year that you made two major mistakes that we pointed out to you at committee stage, and you guillotined the legislation. And the last words I had on this bill is you got it wrong in terms of the concrete levy, because you defined concrete wrong. The core materials of concrete was defined wrong in the legislation. So this again is a levy on house building in the middle of a housing crisis, a cost that's been borne by those who are trying to buy their first home. Section 89 of this bill addresses the serious flaws of the levy and the legislation which I raised with the Department and with the Revenue regarding precast concrete products and also autoclaved aerated concrete. And I must point out to you, it was made clear to us in the Finance Committee that the reason autoclaved aerated concrete had to be included is because of substitution, legal advice of substitution, but they are not included at this point in time. It is a flawed proposal. It was badly drafted, badly put together. The Minister wouldn't listen, would not listen to what was being said in the Finance Bill. Now you have to introduce a rebate scheme because he's got it wrong, and he's guillotine legislation, just as you're doing with this legislation, to not allow the opposition actually to tell you how you've got it wrong in this regard in terms of drafting something that should never be drafted in the first place. In relation to corporation tax, Minister, a key driver of revenue growth has been the corporation tax receipts, and that revenue stream, as I've said many times, could be volatile with its future course uncertain. The scale of expected surpluses and their nature has led to a wide discussion on how these should be treated and what use they should be committed to. And the Government have outlined its intention to save a portion of these receipts by establishing two separate funds, the Future Ireland Fund to be earmarked for future costs such as healthcare and pension arising from demographic change, and the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. Sinn Féin supports the objective of saving a portion of these receipts to fund expenditure investment in the medium and long term, and we have made our position crystal clear. Notwithstanding this, we have also made it clear that the level of public investment next year in housing and healthcare and climate action is insufficient to meet the needs of our society. And I have said the concentration of tax receipts among a small number of foreign multinationals points to a clear risk, but also indicates a clear need. To increase the growth and profitability of indigenous firms to support balanced growth, investment and job creation. We've long called for the R&D tax credit to be introduced and increased to 30%, and also payable credits to firms made in the first year. This legislation goes a part of the way in in that regard. A key part of the bill is in relation to section 90 to 94, which concerns Pillar 2 of the OECD tax agreement by almost 140 countries. Pillar 2 aims to ensure that businesses with consolidated group revenues of €750 million or more pay a 15% effective tax rate on their profits in each jurisdiction that they operate. These provisions of the legislation are highly technical and will require consideration at committee stage. Pillar 2 involves a number of linked rules, the global anti-base erosion rules, and they include a number of rules that need to be very clearly scrutinised. The legislation is introducing the QDTT in order to afford revenue the opportunity to claim the primary tax and rights over excess profits of low-tax constituent entities located here. And I understand the reasons for this course of action and again look forward to dealing with this at committee stage. There is significant change to our tax code in this bill, one that has been reached following long negotiations of OECD level, and it's good to see that it has finally made its way into legislation. I will say, after all the press releases that have been issued about Sinn Féin and threat to increasing corporation tax, I just want to make the point that it is Fianna Fáil Minister for Finance that actually produces the legislation to increase our corporation tax. Notwithstanding that, we support the OECD BEPS proposal and look forward to, if this gets to committee stage, to scrutinise it further. Thank you.